Assalamu alaikum. I hope you are doing well. Today, we're doing a presentation on Kalam, the Islamic cosmological arguments, and I'm Khoshal Zafar. So, firstly, what is Kalam? To understand what Kalam is, we first need to understand what cosmology is. And cosmology is the science of understanding the origins of the universe. It's We use mostly a posteriori operations. By this, it's operations where we go from the present throughout the causal chain to the original cause. So that's like they say, it's the Big Bang is the original cause. We'll talk about this a little bit more later, between the difference between transient causes and immanent causes. So the Big Bang is considered the immanent cause of the universe, or the starting point. The immanent cause in Kalam would of course be God for starting the Big Bang, if this theory is the theory that holds. And of course, this is in the domain of metaphysical philosophy. Metaphysical philosophy is the philosophy of understanding our reality. What is reality? What is real? How we perceive our reality, and how our perceptions are different from what actually is, and whether there is actually a complete objective reality or whether it's just all subjective. So, of course, Kalam, it uses the cosmological arguments to argue the metaphysical descriptions of Islamic axioms. And this mostly is the existence of God. However, alongside this, you can also, argue situations such as dualism and if there's a spiritual dimension. But mostly, I mean, these all have to, the first principle is, of course, the existence of God. So most of it is based on the existence of God. Now, also in Kalam and in cosmology, of course, there is some ontological arguments. And by ontological arguments, we mean it uses a priori premises. For that, it means like they're just simply through logic and a priori, as in, you, you can understand certain things just through common sense and logic, rather than you don't need any empiricism, no data, no sensory perceptions, but you just have these ideas already instilled through you just through common sense. So this is also used in Kalam and in cosmology. So first we'll start off with early Kalam. And the early Kalam, one of the first, the original people, original philosophers who have a big name in Kalam is Ibn Sina, are also known as Avicenna. And basically, his argument goes as follows. First of all, he separates a difference between the sense world and the abstract notions. By the senses, it's the senses we perceived, as in basically it's reality versus abstract notions, which is more the logical sense, the logic behind the logical operations of the world. And basically, he calls these logical operations an essence. And basically, this essence is the premise between all of reality. There has to be an essence before there's an actual reality that we can sense. So there must be this logical follow through before we have any sensory operations. And basically, now we can get to this causal chain. The causal chain is so we have to first understand the difference between transient and immanent causation. Transient causation is when something is caused by something else prior in the causal chain. But it's not, for example, okay, if you push a rock and the rock moves, the rock the causation of the rock moving is the push from the hand. But it's just gonna happen automatically. It's a natural law. But something different is imminent causation, when something happens which forms a new causal chain. And here we have to also, now we have to talk about agents, and we're going to have to talk about possible and necessary agents. So possible are all agents, basically they're possibilities of situations occurring. And then you have necessary agents, which means this agent has to occur. And so basically, once you understand, like, the necessary, this agent has to exist. So basically, the argument goes that, okay, first of all, you have this whole universe. That's okay, and that's you have the real universe, and you have this essence of the universe. And now, the first of all, in Ibn Sina's argument, he assumes that time is infinite. There is no original causation of that. However, the thing is, in order for this physical universe to exist, he says that the physical universe is a possibility. It comes from the sensory perception, reality, but there must be an essence, because there must be something necessary to have created this whole universe. He's separating the fact that, okay, we have this whole universe within us, but there's nothing which has caused it. Like, something has to have designed it in order for it to operate. So that's what the necessary is. The designer is the necessary, and the universe, which is the caused action, is the possibility which has occurred through transient. Well, first it's occurred, from the necessary agent has occurred it through imminent causation, and it has occurred, the possibility has manifested into reality from that imminent causation, through all this through these transient causations, which keeps the universe flowing into its because the universe is always flowing. And so that basically means that, okay, if imminent causation must occur by a prime mover, which is the necessary agent, God is by definition the prime mover, and therefore, and there must be imminent causation for this universe to exist in reality, because it must exist in the essence first, which is of course held by the necessary agents. In order for it to become into reality, there must be an imminent cause. So therefore, there must have been an imminent cause to create the universe. That means that imminent causes are caused by prime movers. Prime movers are basically, by definition, ones who do imminent causes, and also the prime mover. God, by definition, is a prime mover. Therefore, God must exist. That's Ibn Sina's argument. Now, the next argument, which is Al-Ghazali's argument, which is a lot simpler, because the Ibn Sina argument, I feel, was very abstract and complicated. But here we have Al-Ghazali's argument, and he starts off with the premise that the universe is a material object. And the second premise, now here, this is what also simplifies it, because in Ibn Sina's argument, he assumed that there was infinite time. But here, Al-Ghazali claims that infinite regression doesn't exist in the material world, that it's basically infinite regression assumes that time is not infinite. So now from this idea that time is not infinite, he can form a new argument. And I mean, later we will discuss that actually it seems that he's right to assume that time is not infinite through a more modern sense, a more modern scientific sense. But you can get that, okay, from an old age philosophical sense, he would assume that everything has to have a beginning, or else how can it come into existence? without a beginning, especially because okay, the world is always changing throughout nature. Everything seems to have a beginning. So if you use that um, those axioms applied to the universe at large, you will see that you would assume that it has a beginning as well. So therefore, he says that time is not infinite, therefore infinite regression doesn't exist in the material world. The next premise is whatever begins to exist must have a cause, which means it must have, come about to exist. Therefore, the universe began to exist because, okay, so whatever begins to exist must have a cause. Therefore, the universe began to exist, and therefore the universe has a cause. And if the universe has a cause, therefore God must exist. Well, some a prime mover must exist in order to cause it, because we must have imminent causation to produce a universe, because imminent causation is the first cause starting a new causal chain. And the prime mover, God by definition is a prime mover, or we can even say one of the attributes of God. If you look at some of his names, Al-Awwal, Al-Khalaq, even if you want to, maybe you could make an argument even that even um, uh, Al-Akhir is also explores that God is a prime mover. Therefore, okay, so now just to recap, okay, the universe is a material object, and infinite regression doesn't exist in the material world. Therefore, the universe must have a beginning. Okay, whatever begins to exist must have a cause. Whatever has a cause must be produced by a prime mover, and God is a prime mover, or God is the prime mover by definition. Therefore, God must exist. Now we can look into New Kalam. This branch is more, it works more into the use of science and prophecies and the Islamic text. And basically, the argument is simple. The argument is if the text has items in it, or if the text has concepts or talks about things which it's not possible to be known at that specific time when the text was produced, then it must be a revelation through divine revelation. Divine revelation must mean that there's a God. And that's of course because, unless they could, at that time they could travel to the future, which I mean, obviously they couldn't. They wouldn't be able to come up. It would be impossible for this information to be known at that time, showing that this is a divine text through divine revelation, or in the case of hadiths, through divine inspiration. And for example, we can just use some examples here. And actually, in the next slide, we will discuss some some evaluations of this of what's known as ijaz, which is using looking at science and the Quran, looking at stating whether there's proof in it in certain lines. And one of the things is we can look at, okay, how strong each argument is. And there's two examples from the Quran here. The first one is I would say is a less strong example, but it works because you can't, if the Quran's talking about scientific things, it has a very large risk that it's going to occur to make errors errors. However, because there's no errors, therefore you can inductively say that there's a high probability that it is a divine text, but that's of course not the strongest argument, because we need to look at a more deductive argument which clearly shows that the science, like there's no doubt that the science is 100% incorporated. So, for example, the first one: does man not think that we shall? Does man think we shall not put his bones back together? In fact, we can reshape his very fingertips. And of course, the fingertips are known as the identity part. They're very complicated as well. Is very unique. But that's the thing. The first one I was discussing, we were trying to discuss the first one as not as strong, because because there is we could say there's a slight ambiguity in the interpretation if we were to say that, okay, maybe it's been stretched out and the fingertips are not necessarily, one can argue that the fingertips are not necessarily they're referencing any sort of identity. But that is an argument that one could use as a rebuttal for the argument for this being as a correct ijaz. But now the next one is a stronger one, because here it talks exactly in terms of of how a baby is formed. Okay, first we created man from an essence of clay. And interesting, I looked online, and they were stating that, okay, the clay as well, if we look at the elements of the clay and we look at the elements of the body, and it's I mean, of course, maybe there's like slight variation in the very minor, minerals. And of course, like different clays, different areas, but the basic clay, the basic structure, it's the same elements. But of course, that's also, we can say it's an inductive, less strong argument compared to the one about the child development. And that's because, of course, you can make an argue that, okay, a lot of matter, you could even say it's coincidence, but that's the thing, it's all about, with the inductive arguments, all about the probabilities. So we can't say this as strong as the other one, but of course, it's a dialectic counter opposing arguments, and one must decide, what weight we can give to each argument. But then to continue, then we placed him as a drop of fluid in a safe space. Then we made that drop into an alaqa. The alaqa is interesting, this term, because the alaqa, it looks like it can be like a blood clot, it can also be a suspension, and it can also be a leech. And if we look at the fetal's development, we can see that, well, it's very similar to a blood clot. It's also, the shape is a lot like a leech. And of course, it's suspended, it's attached, once it starts growing in a suspended manner. And we made that form into a lump, and we made that lump into bones, and we clothed those bones with flesh, and later we made him into other forms. Glory be to God, the best of creators. Now, as we can see also, it looks that first the bones are developed, then the flesh is wrapped around the bones, which, if you can see, it almost seems counterintuitive to what we would assume were to occur in the body. But now with new science, we found that that's the case. So this is clearly not a priori knowledge. This is something that very high probability it comes through divine revelation. Now there's another example from hadith where it's okay. The Prophet ﷺ said the building of Bayt al-Maqdis will be followed by by the destruction of which will follow conquest. Okay, it's saying that first Beit al-Maqdis will be, it will be under the Muslim rule, and also the conquest of Constantinople. I don't understand. To be honest, I don't know what the destruction of Yathrib means. But as you can see, these things did occur, um, which means that the prophecy has occurred. It's been correct. So that also, you know, that can be seen as divine inspiration. And now, of course, like the argument goes that, okay, if the book is divine, if the book is, yeah, if the book is divine, I mean, this comes from divine inspiration, then, it obviously, if it's divine, there must be a God. So there, I mean, previously in the last, I was talking about, the evaluation of the different ijaz. Okay, for example, even in the hadith, we're going to talk just briefly, like, okay, one can say that, okay, of course, there's hadith criticism. You can say that some hadiths are, maybe there's some fabrication, maybe, misinterpretation. So that's also part of the thing, because I didn't evaluate the hadiths. But along the same lines, I mean, some are strong and some are weak. But now the other issues is that these days some people really overreach to declare something as a proof, and then you have very questionable arguments. Um, very, for example, in this one book, Islam's Quantum Questions, the Nidal Gulsum, he talks about some of these uh, some of these writers, these say philosophers or scholars. Like for one of them, for example, was saying that, okay, if we take certain, numbers, certain, amounts of words in the Quran and assign them a number, and then we give we multiply, we add all these numbers together, you get the speed of light. And it's like, well, it doesn't really make sense. He was saying something along those lines, and it's like, okay, where is the basis for the argument? And sometimes a lot of this is the case for some of these, maybe some of the articles, like, for example, okay, if you get the amount of times light is mentioned, and you give it a number and you multiply all the amount of lights times it says light in the Quran, you will get the speed of light. And it's like, well, I mean, there's a problem with that argument, because you can very easily, manipulate it. It's not a proper argument. And okay, sometimes people, they change the interpretations of the text, so they can, bring about some of these, so they can say it's a proof, but really it's not a proof. And this is dangerous, because it's basically weakening the field of ijaz. Now people will say, like, okay, like now it loses its credibility, and also, of course, it's fake information. It's like not. I mean, it's very easy to attack as well, which is just not good for, let's say, like the PR of the ijaz field. And now, yeah, of course, there's variability of interpretation. Maybe, some people will interpret it some way, and some other people interpret it in another way, the same line, and then it could have two different meanings. And of course, then we can't necessarily say that we can apply ijaz to one meaning and not ijaz to the other meaning, because I mean, it won't make sense in one meaning, but it'll make sense in another meaning. So then there's that as well. That's another issue which might occur. Now, okay, after that, now once we pass the new Kalam, we have maybe the new Kalam. Like now, this is the modern physics. And basically modern physics works on basically a new branch of logic, and I mean this in mathematical sense, because now the new branches of physics, they use mathematical induction, and by this it basically means probabilistic models, rather compared to the previous deductive models where you have linear equations. So now it's not. I mean, you have to use matrices and probabilities, and I mean everything. It's just basically a probability grid, or you have a probability chart. I mean, you don't know where, if you fire an electron through a double slit, we don't even know which slit it's going to go through. Some people even argue it goes through both slits. Where does it end up on the sensor on the back behind the slit? I mean, it's all about the probability distribution. So it's like, okay, now our basic deductive logic, so our basic mathematics, the ones which are really claimed to be logical, because now this inductive mathematics, it's not logical. We don't, because we can't really see the mechanism fully. It's more like, okay, we can only guess through a probability chart. So now this changes the whole field, because of course now it's like, okay, we can't even, first of all, the arguments can be made on now. This changes the whole field of argumentation. Okay, like the new scientific discoveries, we can really find, like for example, okay, we can't find the transient causation of electrons motion, because the electrons motion within, say, the atom, a lot of the times, I mean, not, it depends, not all of its motion, but of course a lot of its motion, it's going to be quite random. That means that now transient causation has been eliminated, because we don't, I mean, there's nothing which is actually causing it to, okay, change direction that we're aware of. So that's now all of a sudden, I mean, our whole causal chain has been changed completely. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean that every deflection of the electron is an imminent causation? I mean, I don't know. That is beyond my domain of knowledge. I don't know if anyone knows, I don't know what theories are out there. But how will this change Kalam? That's quite the interesting idea to think of. And now basically we also have universal expansion. Now this is interesting. This also refers back to Ibn Sina's, no, sorry, Al-Ghazali's concept of infinite regression. It says, well, first of all, let's go to the argument. This is quite a strong development in cosmology, and of course, therefore, Kalam. Well, in just metaphysics in general, and physics, quite a curious concept, and that's the universe. They found, actually, these physicists, they were actually, by mistake, they found some radiation coming from the universe. And once they looked into the radiation more, they realized, okay, wait a second. Actually, the way the radiation changes is telling us that the universe is actually expanding at an increasing rate with no center. That means the universe, well, first of all, if you think of it, if there's no, people usually think we're at the center of the universe, but discover we're not. And if it's, okay, it's expanding at a, first it's expanding at an increasing rate, that's fine. Okay, that's not that complex to understand. But now if you think of it, there's no center of the universe. That means that the structure of the universe must be spherical, but it's hollow at the inside. But there's a problem, because if that's a sphere and it's going to be hollow at the inside, how can the Earth, which is a 3D object, be fit onto that sphere, which is that universe, unless there's some sort of thickness to the sides of the universe? But that would be a problem, because then you wouldn't have the same concept of expansion in 3 dimensions. So, I mean, because if you think of it, okay, if whichever direction you're looking, um, you're gonna somehow be looking inside towards the center of the universe. The problem is the center doesn't exist. So how can we account for that? It just doesn't make logical sense. Uh, So that's another concept that, maybe, I don't know, science will discover something new, but really it stretches the power of our mind. I think, we just run out of our capacity to see the universe. And so basically another thing, you know, after that, it's also now we also understand that time is relative. Okay, it depends where you are in space and also the speed you're traveling at that dictates you know the the time and how long a second is. So that also, now that's a whole different argument, because um, if actually I think, yeah, this is actually on the next slide. Let me just finish this slide first. So basically the universe is expected also to reverse in direction, and this can also approve Al-Ghazali's concept of the possibility of infinite regression. Oh, that's all. Actually, we'll go into that next slide more. Because also the fact that these arguments are going to be discussed in more detail in the next slide, but this also can be used as a premise that time is real and an argument for time being created. This further can be expanded into Kalam. Here, these are just some basics. I mean, of course, you can do so much with these ideas. There's so many branches, but here is just some possibilities. Okay, first of all, time is relative to spatial positioning and velocity, and then time must therefore be real, not just purely essence. Because if you think of it, okay, if time is actually different in different locations, that and there's some sort of, you can actually see that there is an effect of time, which proves to us that time is an actual concept. If it's an actual concept, if it's real, then as we go through, the previous arguments by Ibn Sina, all his structure, okay, Al-Ghazali, um, those argumentative structures, we can see, okay, I mean, if it's a real thing, I mean, if it's real, it must have been created. That was Ibn Sina's argument, but we're just now transposing it onto time. Now, everything that exists must be created. Therefore, there must be a creator of time. That's God. So that's one. That's an argument about time, which determines that, okay, God exists because time exists. Now, also something outside of time would be a non-material entity. Now, this is another argument. These are just roots for arguments. Now, of course, you can have many different variations on these, incorporated into a more complicated, more complex argument that may, argument from a different perspective. If you have the different branches, you can have a more stronger argument uh, due to more proofs, more elaboration to eliminate, say, more easier uh, to not more easier, but you can eliminate some sort of some forms of rebuttal. But let's continue with this. Something outside of time would be a non-material entity. Therefore, there must be at least one non-material entity. This implies a possibility of a spiritual dimension. Now, this is other side of Kalam, which, okay, we can talk. See, this is just the beginning here. But of course, now, okay, this can be, transposed, okay, an argument to prove God's existence, but also beside that, okay, it talks about dualism, okay, rather than just a simple materialism. We can say, okay, once we start talking about a spiritual dimension or another dimension, we get into, okay, possibilities for dualism, to prove that the soul exists, and these sort of axioms that, you know, that we would want to prove in Kalam. And thank you. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope you learned something and found it interesting. I hope you have a nice day. Assalamu alaikum.